provided water to Aldgate, and we know that was dated, the first piped water was 1535. And I have a story about somebody who was actually living in Aldgate, and she's actually part of my Black Tudors tour. And her name is Mary Phyllis, and we've got her baptism record. And the baptism record is actually dated the 3rd of June, 1596, no, 97, sorry, I got it wrong. And what's interesting about Mary Phyllis is she's actually a black Moor, so it says Mary Phyllis known as being a black Moor, and I think there's some packs going around you can see. And we have a very detailed parish record, so it's a bit of hit and miss. And her parish record tells you a lot about her. Now what we know is that she was actually a servant for someone called John Barker, and she was living in Mark Lane. And Mark Lane is in Aldgate. And she was a servant, came here from Morisco, and there was a huge debate about whether she came directly from Morocco or whether she came from Andalusia, who had a Moriscan community. And she came here when she was about 6 or 7. She was a servant. Now, being a servant, it's very sad, but her father did come with her, but he was living outside London. He probably wanted her to be a servant in a house where she had board and lodging. And we don't know if she actually carried water, but she certainly, as a servant, would have had access to that water, that conduit in Aldgate. And as a servant, she would have collected water for the household, and she also would have drank it. So, although she's not from Hackney, and we don't know if she visited it, she certainly did drink some of Hackney's water in her time. And her record is really interesting because she talks about who her father was. She talks about that she's about 20 years of age when she's actually baptised. She's actually baptised in St Botolph's Church, which is in Aldgate as well, but it's not in the city, it's just outside. Aldgate's parish was there's a parish called St Botolph's, and it's sort of part in Aldgate and part outside, part in the city and part outside the city. So that's why they've got a huge population of black Moors. And what's interesting, during the 15 and 1600s, looking at the baptism records in St Botolph's, 1 in 12 people would have been a black Moor. And a black Moor would have been someone who came from the Andalusia or North Africa. So if you're black, that means you're a black person like myself. If you're a Tawny Moor, you're an Arab. So this is very interesting. So she is our first Tudor tale, probably a water carrier. And if she didn't carry water, she certainly drank Hackney water. And you can see her, I think there's packs going around with you, is a teacher in Hackney. Now, are we sort of familiar with education during Tudor times? What do we know about it? So I sound very teacher-like, don't I, when I say that? Okay. Okay, so what we do know is children were educated. Girls tended not to be educated, not because they weren't allowed, but it's because it was better if they were educated on how to be a good wife and, to run a home. So parents wouldn't spend money educating a girl, they would tend to educate a boy. Now, during medieval times, education was really the remit of the church. So a church would have a grammar school, and they were responsible teaching Latin, maybe some Greek as well, and religious studies, and you'd learn philosophy. So it was a very classical education, and also very much controlled by the church. Now you've got our lovely Henry VIII, and Henry VIII is responsible again for the Reformation. So with the Reformation, you have a change in education system. Now Henry VIII has actually been sort of coined as being someone who revolutionised schooling and education, but actually I wouldn't actually agree. I would say he was more involved. It was more an evolutionary process as opposed to a revolutionary process. And what an interesting statement is Henry, the only act that Henry actually was responsible for with education was in 1512, and he required that boys between the age of 7 and 17 should be provided with a bow and 2 arrows and be able to learn how to use them. So that's Henry for you. Anyway, so with the Reformation, you have this change where there's a shift of ownership of education, and it's taken away from the churches. So what you have is you have all of these foundations, these trusts that then become responsible for education, and they're supervised by the church rather than the church having the full control. And you have a growth of what we call public schools, and with the public schools you've got it's a more liberal education, and it's based on humanism opposed to this very strict Catholic Church. Right. Now what's interesting is you've got this growth of, also you've got the schools closing down and then with the churches, but you've got new ones, and these new ones have this sort of different governance. Now there's something called the Commissary Court of London, and they're actually responsible for parishes. And what's interesting is, dated in 1599, there is a record of someone called Alice Ray, and she's a schoolmistress in Hackney, and she's teaching in the house of someone called Robert Simpson. She's teaching both boys and girls, but the problem is she doesn't have a licence, she's unlicensed, and I'm not sure what the outcome was, but there is a presentation about her being this unlicensed schoolmistress. Now what's interesting is, one, it's illegal, two, she's teaching both boys and girls, and the other thing, this was probably be the first record of a private school in Hackney, so we're going back to 1599. And in your pack, you will see the records. I've taken these from the archives, and it's her case. We actually are not sure where it is, but we think it's somewhere near Church Street, linked probably to a. But it was in someone's house. So it was the house. Yeah.
The archives were.
National Archives. Yeah. Okay. So it was in the house of Robert Simpson in Hackney, but we don't know where. So the actual record you can see. So we're going back to 1599 for the first private school in Hackney, and schoolmistress as well. But unfortunately, I don't know what the actual outcome of this case was, because you find a lot of the records are not there, so you just have partial records.
So she would have been fined, or just?
She would have been fined, yeah. But we don't know. So that went to court. Right. Okay, right. So I'm going to tell a story about the blackmailers, or there's one in particular, our lovely John. Okay, so we have the lovely Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux. There's a patient of him in fact. Now he was a favourite of Elizabeth I, and he was part of the royal court. Oh, thank you, he's got a nice face. Okay. And he had someone who worked for him, a servant called John Daniell. And John Daniell was a bit on the make. He wanted to be part of the royal household, and he felt that if he worked with the Earl of Essex, eventually he could work in the royal household as part of Elizabeth I's household. His wife Jane, who was Flemish, she worked for the Earl of Essex's wife, Elizabeth Countess of Essex. So she would be a gentlewoman and a gentleman. Okay. The Earl of Essex was favourite of Elizabeth, but then he was out of favour, became out of favour, and that was solely due to, sorry, I'm speaking properly, Sir Walter Raleigh and William Cecil. So they sort of were whispering in Elizabeth's ear that he wasn't very good, and he sort of fell from favour. And then in 1599, unfortunately, there was a failed battle in Ireland, and he was put under house arrest. So fell from favour. John Daniell's not very happy because he's invested a lot of time being friends with him, cozying up with the Earl of Essex so that he could actually, improve his social standing. Meantime, Elizabeth is worried her husband's under house arrest, and she's worried that it could be the fault of their family. Anyway, there are some letters that he's written, and his wife is frightened that now he's under house arrest, they may decide to take some of their personal belongings, and they will find these incriminating letters. We've got no idea what's in the letters. We think it could be something to do with treason or adultery. So she trusts them on her gentle woman. She says, look, take these letters, keep them safe. She takes them home. What happens? John sees them and says, oh, lots of interesting information in there. So he decides to blackmail Elizabeth.
Ooh.
Okay, he demands £3,000 for Elizabeth. Elizabeth sells some of her jewellery, and she comes up with 1,700. I think there's the exact amounts in my notes. Anyway, she then gets the rest of the money, and John gives her the letters back. But John does something very, very crafty. Well, the first payment he gets, he pays someone called Peter Bales, who also works with Earl of Essex, who's a forger. And he forges them. So he does a forgery, he gives the forgery back to Elizabeth, and keeps the originals for himself. Anyway,
What a wrong'un.
yeah, a wrong'un, he really is a wrong'un. Anyway, so the money that he makes, he then buys a house at the rectory, and him and his wife Jane are living in Hackney, and they've got a lavish house, and they're really enjoying their lifestyle. They have lots of nice people visiting them, like the Earl of Oxford. Have I got this right? Yep, okay. So, all's fine. Beautiful house. Then what happens a month later? The Earl of Essex has a failed coup. Takes place in a failed coup against Elizabeth, and he gets arrested and obviously is executed. So he really falls from favour there. Everybody who's linked to him is also arrested, including Peter Bells. Now John Daniell, he's no longer working for the Earl of Essex. He's okay now. He's got some money. He's up and coming. He's in Hackney with the beautiful air. It's nice and green, you know. Anyway, it's not known who grassed him up, but some say it's Peter Bells, some say it's the Earl of Essex. But anyway, he was found out to be a forger, and he was thrown into a Fleet prison, and his house that he had was sold to somebody called, let me see if I can remember his name.
He was a forger as well. Oh, no, he's the forger.
He's the forger.
Oh, he's the forger.
He paid him to be the forger.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so he spent his blackmail money for her on a lavish house in Hackney. Okay. Fernando Hayborn bought their house, and they couldn't own the house, and poor John was in prison. Anyway, he was released from prison under the reign of James I in 1604, and he did try to go to court to get his property back, and he didn't get his property back, and eventually died in 1610 in his lodgings in Westminster. But we know that his wife remained in Hackney, and it's said in some texts, it says that she was still living in the Hackney Rectory, but I don't know if someone else owned it, but I've got no idea. But anyway, she did actually go back into court, but her reputation was damaged, and she's just very, very bitter about it all. So these are your blackmailers to talk about. They do? Okay, hi. Okay, you've got the pack. So the first one is in 1571, and it's a case of someone called John Shepherd, and he was attacked by Thomas Ferries, a butcher on the road of Kingsland to Newington, and it was in the south end of Kingsland High Street and Stoke Newington High Street. So I think this is where we are, somewhere around here. Anyway, Shepherd plunged a meat knife through Ferry's body near the heart, killing him instantly. And we do have the actual record here. So this is a court record. So that would have probably been motivated by a theft. The second one we have is, again in this area, and this one is a bit more detailed. This is a gang of 5 men, and it's in 1575. And 5 men assaulted Matthew Davy, and he's a servant of William Marshall, in the highway at Hackney, and we think that could be on Mare Street. And they stole goods and chattels that belonged to William Marshall, so that's actually motivated by theft. And what's interesting is you've got a list of things that were there. So again, that's your court record, and these are the type of things that he had on it. He was robbed him of 5 yards of blue woolen cloth, which is worth about 35 shillings. So don't forget, you could actually be imprisoned if you stole, I think, was it 10 shillings? He's also got some satin cloth as well. He's got a Spanish leather jerkin worth 13 shillings. I don't know what jerkin is. Woolen cloth. Oh, is it? Oh, yes. Okay, a jacket. Okay. He's got a piece of woolen cloth of marble colour worth 13 shillings. And they were all found guilty and sentenced to be hung. Oh, except for Robert Mary. Most people carried a knife, and your life, it wasn't very safe, especially in the City of London as well. So what we do have around here, with lots of robberies taking place, robberies would have been motivated obviously by theft and wanting to take goods, which we have now. So what we do know is things haven't changed. So wherever you go, time, whatever, you always have people, there's always needs and wants. But you do have lots and lots of records, because this was actually part of Middlesex, so we have lots and lots and lots of cases rather than building up over 2 years. Oh. hospital, a leper hospital, and the hospital, the site was somewhere around here, but I've been told by a local historian that it's actually where this Leyland building is. That's where the hospital was. So the hospital actually wasn't for the residents of Hackney. It was actually for the residents of the City of London. And what they did is they created hospitals because leprosy, I'm saying it now, was rife in the 12th and 13th century. So what was decided that they would have hospitals outside the City of London, and they would actually be communities of people who were lepers, who would actually be kept together in these communities, but also they would have to have chapels in those hospitals as well, where they would actually, you know, practice a Christian life as well. So you had this hospital was around since the 12th century, 12th, 13th century, and it was actually located over there. Now what happened is, in the 1500s, it became part of an outpost of St Bart's Hospital in Smithfield. And what you found is, as leprosy went down, the number of people who had leprosy, you had different people coming in, and I can actually tell you what sort of ailments they had. So around that time, you had people with, so some had diarrhea, headaches, but also a lot suffered from venereal diseases as well. So we know that, as I said, in 1549 it was operated an outpost of Bart's Hospital. It was run by men called guides. It was actually funded by people who were just leaving lots of money to these hospitals to look after the sick. So what else have we got? So that's where it would have been. We know that in 1613 there was an additional ward, and it was called the Swetley Ward. And by 1669 there were 6 wards, and inmates were provided with wheaten bread, beef, soup, beer, cheese or butter, and water gruel or milk porridge. Not bad. We also know that by 1669 the hospital was reserved for women only. So very, very interesting. Now, as I said, this hospital initially were people who were in the City of London who were lepers. That's what it was for. But we also know, as I said earlier, there was a hospital, a medieval hospital in Old Street, so that would have had the people who lived in Hackney there as well. Okay, now the very last story I'm going to talk about is the old. And as I said, my background, I love doing Tudor history, and I do Black Tudors, that's what my tours are about. And unfortunately, I couldn't find anyone black I could talk about other than this person, and we had a burial record of someone called Anthony, and he's actually St John's Parish, and he's buried in 1630, which is just outside the Tudor period. So the Tudor period is up until 1603, and what we know is that, it's very odd, he's like Anthony, an old Negro, so he's Paul, an old Negro, and it's interesting, you move from blackamoor to Negro, so when you start looking through parish records, you can just see the terminology changing, and he actually supposedly lived to the age of 105. So I've had this huge debate with my friend, and she doesn't believe it, and I don't think anybody does believe it. But anyway, someone's told he was 105, and that's what's been put down, that's what's been recorded as. And we know nothing about Anthony, but I will tell you that during Tudor times, and even the early Stuart period, enslavement was illegal. So if you had anybody who was black, they wouldn't have been enslaved unless they had come with a Spanish or Portuguese person who was defying the law. But generally people would have just been living normally side by side with their other parishioners. Now this intrigued me because I thought, okay, well, 105 is a ripe old age, and do you think he was the oldest person who lived during the Tudor period? Because he would have been around if he was 105, because that would have made him, what, he would have been around the 1500s? Anyway, I came across someone called Thomas Parr, and Thomas Parr apparently lived until he was 152. So, okay, and the thing is, there is a painting of him, and it's in your pack, and this was taken when he was 152.
Looks pretty good.
Yeah, so I had a conversation with my son, and my son doesn't believe he was 152. But what I thought I'd do to end it was something that's quite funny, just his life story. So what we know about him is his name's Thomas Parr, and he was either born in 1482 or 1483, and that makes him being born when Edward IV was king. And Edward IV was Henry VIII's grandfather. He was the father of the princes in the Tower. So lived a ripe old age if he was around when Edward IV was born, was a king. Okay. He lived in a hamlet in Shropshire, and we know that he was married twice. Now, at the age of 100, he allegedly had an affair, and he fathered a child out of wedlock. So I don't know any men at 100 who've had children. Anyway, this is what's recorded about him. And he had to, he was punished by his church, and he had to do a public penance. Anyway, after the death of his first wife, he married again at 110. And he married a widow, at the age, his first wife died when he was 110, and he married again at 122. Okay. Anyway, in 1635, the Earl of Arundel, which is Thomas Howard, he actually found out about Parr, and there was like stories about this man who lived till he was 152. Anyway, he brought him to meet King Charles I, and he was a bit of a novelty when he came to London. Apparently, there were crowds on the streets of London dying to see him, to touch him, and he also had some of his portraits painted by Van Dyck and also by Rubens, so he was that famous. Anyway, he met with Charles I, and Charles I apparently asked him, what was his secret to his longevity, and he talked about the fact that he had an affair. So Charles was a bit perturbed, thinking, well, why are you talking about all the bad things? Anyway, while he was in London, he actually didn't survive, he actually passed away, and they think it was the food and the climate. But anyway, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, and there's an inscription talking about his remarkable age. But anyway, down the line, we now think that he probably wasn't 152, and they think they confused his age with his grandfather, because he couldn't recall anything that took place in the 15th century or even the 16th century. But what we do have is a painting of him where they claim that he is 152.
Even though he looks about 58. He's probably right, if it was his grandfather.
Who we think carried water, but at least drank some water from Hackney. We had the teacher who defied all the odds, and she actually opened the first private school in Hackney in 1599. We have the blackmailers, the Daniells, and you've got the forger and his fraud from Grace. And then you've got the lawlessness, where you've got crime being committed on the high street, which you get in any London high street now. And we have the sick, site of our lepers hospital. And then lastly, we've got the old. We've got two lovely old men. We've got Anthony, and we've got lovely old Thomas Parr, who's 152 years old. So I just want to say thank you very much to everybody, and I hope you found